Biden, get back. Get your boot off Cuba's neck. Biden, get back. Get your boot off Cuba's neck. Biden, get back. Get your boot off Cuba's neck. Biden, get back. Get your boot off Cuba's neck. Last night, there was a violent terrorist attack on the people of Cuba on behalf of, in a way that represents nothing but the terrorist capability of those who act in the interest of the United States. It highlights the utter hypocrisy of the designation of Cuba as a so-called state sponsor of terror, and a title imposed by the United States falsely when we know that it's an utter lie. Cuba sí bloqueo no! Cuba sí bloqueo no! Cuba sí bloqueo no! Cuba sí bloqueo no!
What the U.S. government has been doing is violence, violence, violence. Because let's be clear, it's not just Molotov cocktails or AK-47s that kills people. It is sanctions. It is this brutal blockade. And I am so ashamed of my own government. When you go to Cuba and you see how hard people are working to keep their healthcare system functioning, and in the midst of all these scarcities, where a country, Cuba, spends only $800 a year on its healthcare system per person, while the U.S. is spending $11,000 per person, Cuba has better healthcare statistics than the United States does.
This is the second violent act against the Cuban Embassy in the past 3 years. Veteran diplomat Cuban Ambassador Jose Cabañas and his team were threatened when a terrorist carrying an AK-47 shot up the Cuban Embassy just over a mile away from the White House. IFCO Passes for Peace joins Cuba's friends across the globe in condemning this vicious attack and to demand a thorough investigation of this heinous crime. It is high time that the U.S. government refrain from sheltering such perpetrators and bring them to justice. Now more than ever is the time for all of us to raise our collective voices in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Cuba. We invite each and every one of you to become a beacon of hope and sign the Let Cuba Live campaign. Help circulate the petition calling for Cuba to be removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list. Join countless those across the globe as we stand shoulder to shoulder, unyielding in our support for Cuba. Let's show the world that love, unity, and justice will always prevail over hate. Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live!
Cuba sí! Cuba sí! Cuba sí! We have to give a round of applause for Dr. Samira Adri because she made so many amazing points. The #1 terrorist in the world, it's not Cuba. It's not the people sending doctors across the world. It's U.S. imperialism. #1 terrorist, U.S. imperialist. #1 terrorist. U.S. imperialist. #1 terrorist. U.S. imperialist. #1 terrorist. U.S. imperialist.
Where is the tough on crime crowd when this terrorist attack happens on this embassy? Where is Brooke Pinto, who is pushing basically anti-democratic laws to lock up young black and brown kids in southeast and east of the river when a terrorist attack is happening right here in Northwest DC? Where is she? Where is the mayor? Where is Mayor Muriel Bowser? Looking the other way. I ask it too. So I think we all have a responsibility here to hold our elected officials here in DC and our special location being in DC, our federal officials, to their feet. And I want to commend the NNOC, Kala, Cheryl LaBosch, other friends here who got arrested in Bob Menendez's office a few months ago. And look at him. Look at him. Yeah, a crook, a mobster. found with how many gold plates in his house, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen, and this man is controlling our policy against Cuba.
When you throw gasoline bombs at the Cuban Embassy, it's not simply theater, it's not simply performative, it's designed to set the building on fire, it's designed to kill the inhabitants inside the building. It is, by all definitions, a terrorist act. So that's pretty observable. I looked at the Washington Post today and the New York Times. I flipped on the TV, as objectionable as it is to look for a moment at CNN, and where's the coverage of a terrorist attack in the heart of Washington, D.C. against an embassy which is considered to be by Vienna Convention an inviolable institution? But then I'm thinking, well, just 4 years ago, the U.S. government actually seized the embassy of Venezuela in an effort to overthrow, carry out regime change against another sovereign government, again in violation of the Vienna Convention. The Vienna Convention is very clear. All diplomatic compounds are considered to be inviolable, even at a time of war, because all embassies in all countries want to make sure that their diplomatic personnel are not willy-nilly subject to violent acts. The terrorist attack yesterday should be understood for what it is. One of many thousands of attacks. I'm not saying hundreds, thousands of terrorist acts against the Cuban Revolution since it dared to become and take Cuba to become a free people and a free country, evicting the United States, evicting Wall Street, evicting the gangsters. And because Cuba dared to be free, Cuba has been subjected to endless terrorism.
Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live! I can't hear you!
Cuba live!
Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live!
Let Cuba live!
Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. Which country brokered yet another peace deal between Colombia and rival groups in the country? What country was that?
Cuba.
What country, if it's a state sponsor of terrorism, sends doctors who are trained to be doctors at the expense of the government around the world in response to natural disasters and catastrophes, world-renowned around the world, just helping humanity? What country does that?
Cuba.
But what country has blocked those doctors from responding to Katrina here? What country has been behind the attempted and proposed invasion of Haiti yet again?
USA.
What country has declared that it's going to continue its plan Colombia by continuing to support 9 U.S. military bases in Colombia? What country is that?
Cuba.
The United States. Exactly. So who's the state sponsor of terrorism here? It's the United States government and the people they support in this country who would carry out these kinds of attacks on the sovereign soil of Cuba. That's why we are here today. That's why we understand, as members of the Black Alliance for Peace and as members of the Solidarity Network in support of Cuba, that this is not just an issue that affects Cuba, this is an issue that affects the entire Americas, and Cuba is the epicenter.
Stop the lies! Stop the hate!
Stop the lies! Stop the hate!
Cuba's not a terror state!
Cuba's not a terrorist state!
Stop the lies! Stop the hate!
Stop the lies! Stop the hate!
Cuba's not a terror state!
Cuba's not a terrorist state!
Cuban diplomats should not have to live in fear of their lives simply by doing their job, and the U.S. needs to fulfill its duty in the Vienna Convention to protect the embassy and to investigate these attacks. Cuba is a victim of U.S.-backed terrorism, yet the U.S. designates Cuba as a so-called state sponsor of terrorism as part of its illegal economic war against the 11 million Cuban people who we are here standing with today to show that the U.S. government does not represent the voices of the U.S. people. So we call on the U.S. to take Cuba off the list and let Cuba live. Let Cuba live. Let Cuba live. Let Cuba live. Thank you.
The question of who is the state sponsor of terror is pretty easily answered. All we have to do is compare the record of each of these countries. Was it Cuba that invaded Iraq in 2003, killing 1 million Iraqis? No. Was it Cuba that occupied Afghanistan for decades? No. Was it Cuba that kidnapped Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti? No. Was it Cuba that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana? No. Was it Cuba that helped assassinate Patrice Lumumba of the Congo? No. No. It was U.S. imperialism and its lackeys, its so-called junior partners, that carried out these and more crimes than we can count. Back in 2020, Cuba's Center for Historical Investigation into State Security released a report that documented 581 attacks on Cuba's diplomatic representations abroad since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. 581 attacks that left approximately 365 people dead and 721 people injured. And we know that Washington contributed no small number to those attacks. We also know that the United States harbors terrorists like Orlando Bosch, who was involved in the 1976 bombing of Cuban Flight 455, killing 73 people. In that same year, the assassination of Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier. Bosch got to live out his days as a hero amongst the violent far-right community in Miami. And also, you want to talk about terror, let's talk about the Cuban Five. 5 Cuban patriots who were trying to stop terrorism against Cuba being aimed from the United States, and they were imprisoned for that. And they would still be locked up today were it not for a people's movement that demanded their freedom for years. That's right. And that's how the Cuban Five were freed. So my friends, you and I must be very clear about the context, the history, and the reality of why the United States, the most powerful and expansive and sophisticated empire this world has known, and why that country, this government, has been attacking this small socialist island nation for over half a century. What was Cuba's crime? Cuba's crime was having the audacity to have a socialist revolution, to create a society where people's needs were the main priority. The Cuban people were sick of the military dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. They were sick of their country being used as a playground for the rich and a casino for the American mafia. So they rose up, carried out a revolution, and overthrew that US-backed dictatorship. And since Cuba made the decision to have a socialist revolution, to plot its own path, and to practice its own form of socialist democracy, which is much more genuine and thorough and complete than this tortured sham of so-called democracy that we have in the United States. This is why Washington has been attacking Cuba for all of this time.
That's big, big.
Sisters and brothers, this attack that took place last night of 2 Molotovs and the attack that took place on April 30, 2020 of an AK-47 that shot 30 bullets into the embassy could have killed somebody, could have killed several people. They say that the first man who fired at the embassy is mentally ill, and that's why he did this. They want to excuse these acts of terrorism, and the US government refuses to declare it a terrorist act, which they are. And aside from these 2 acts, the United States has engaged since the Eisenhower demonstration and the beginning of the revolution in systematic terrorism, biological assassination, plane bombings, and many other attacks on the Cuban people. Of the 3,478 who died, there are 73 who died a terrifying death on the plane 455, October 6, 1976. And there were 2,099 who've been injured. We should talk about some of those people, about some of the victims and their families who've survived. One young woman, Nancy, her foot was blown off by one of these terrorists who like to strafe the island with machine gun fire. And she spoke years later at a conference on terrorism and said, "I never could wear heels. I could never look like the other girls and women and have my dress because I had a foot missing." This is a pain she's held. I talked to Margarita and a man named Jorge. Their parents died on the Cuban plane. And Jorge says to this day, he says, "I think every day about what could have happened. Maybe my father could have missed his taxi or his ride to the airport if he were only 5 minutes late." And another woman, Margarita, her father helped the bomber that Luis Posada Carriles gave the bombs to. Her father helped him get on the plane. These were innocent people, defenseless people. They had nothing to do except be Cubans living in Cuba. But when Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch each came to the United States, the U.S. never deported them for their crime that was carried out, engineered in Venezuela. Posada Carriles had a march that he led, a big march in Miami. He was given the keys to the city of one of the suburbs of Dade County, Miami. The keys to the city, honored. He was a marshal of a parade. And Obama and Bush refused to deport him for his crime. And George Bush refused to deport Orlando Bosch. There is a man named Santiago Alvarez Fernandez Magriña. He's a terrorist who still lives in Miami today. He has murdered people in Cuba. He is the financier of Posada Carriles. He was the financier for years for Posada. And to show how the U.S. has protected them, because they're agents of the United States. They are trained by the CIA. They are armed by the CIA. In November 2000, I was in Cuba. I was watching television. It was November 17, remember? George Bush. It was still not settled that he was the president, but it was the game was on. And I'm watching TV. Fidel had just landed in Panama. And he got to a podium. He said, "I have an announcement to make." He said, "There are 4 men trying to assassinate me here today," because he was going to speak at a Panamanian college with hundreds of students. And he named the 4 men: Posada Carriles, Pedro Ramon Crispin, Guillermo Novo Sampol, and the 4th one, I'll think of the name. And those men were caught because Fidel named their license plates, where they were, the C4 explosives they had, thanks to Cuba's state security. thanks to the men and the women that have protected Cuba and other Cubans all these years. Well, they were arrested because Panama had to arrest them. They were exposed, although the president was for Bush. And they were tried, but they weren't tried for attempted murder because the detonator of the C4 explosive disappeared before trial. Everything was arranged. And those men were freed after less than 4 years. 3 of them flew right away to Miami, welcomed. These terrorists were received by Miami, but Posada Carriles kept hiding from 2000 to 2005. He never showed his face because Cuba said, any country that harbors Posada Carriles, we're going to break relations with you. So he hid until he showed up in March 2005 in Miami. Who brought him in secretly on a boat through the Miami River? Santiago Alvarez and his supporter, Osvaldo Mitad. For bringing him in for perjury, nothing happened to him. But then they found 2 warehouses full of weapons of this man who brought Posada in. Well, the Answer Coalition, Brian Becker, myself, and many other people had a press conference. We demanded the extradition of Posada. We went to Cuba and interviewed the victims of Posada. And what happened to him after months and months? He's taken to El Paso, tried for perjury, for lying how he came to the U.S., and he was found innocent. He lived the rest of his life in Miami. It's a story that it's a little long, but you need to know the machinations of the U.S. government. And those 2 men that had the warehouse full of weapons, the U.S. attorney of Miami, who later became an Obama official in the Justice Department, he filed a motion to free them early. They served like 2 years. So this is why it's not an accident or just 2 men who have like problems, psychological problems. It's systematic attempt as a whole economic, political, and even invasion war that has taken place against Cuba for everything the people have spoken here about. For a country that's an example. And yes, it is a light. It is a light for the world. No matter how hard their problems are, no matter what we're seeing in the news as so many people have left, because it's so hard with this siege that the U.S. has imposed under Biden. The point is, what other country of the dozens in Africa couldn't have what Cuba has today and want it and welcome it? Free healthcare, free education, no evictions, social peace, equality. Or you name any other country, the dozens in the world. That's why Cuba stands, and we stand with Cuba today and always.
Hello, my name is Bennett, and I am an organizer with the Young Communist League in DC. There has been another terrorist attack on the Cuban embassy in under 5 years. Somebody tried to burn down the embassy. You don't throw molotov cocktails without the intent to burn down a building. It is ironic that the United States government claims that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. The US government has been arming and financing civilians who are ex-Cuban exiles on United States soil to commit terrorist acts against the Cuban government, against the Cuban people, and against the Cuban Revolution since its inception. It is ironic that while the United States here descends into fascism, while we have the threat of fascism at our door, that they have claimed that Cuba is the terrorist state. We have a bolstered program of imperialism. We have a bolstered program of militarism and bigotry and oppression and the destruction of the democratic gains of the working class for the past century. That is on our doorstep. But the United States government tells us that Cuba is the enemy and not the people who are organizing a fascist takeover of the United States government. Just such an example. We have seen an increase in legislation and in attacks on queer and trans people in the United States, unlike we have seen since the 1950s. But what did Cuba just do? Cuba just passed the new Families Code by a majority in their country, the most progressive legislation ever passed freeing LGBTQ people from the grips of homophobia, from transphobia, and the capitalist imperative to form the nuclear family, which oppresses women and children and queer people. Cuba is a leader in freedom on this issue, whereas the United States continues to backslide and to get rid of all of the protections that the gay liberation movement and the trans liberation movement fought for the past 50 years. This past week, I had the opportunity to meet with the president of Cuba, and he showed nothing but love and respect for the American people who are fighting hard against the oppression that is organized by our government. And this respect and love that the Cuban people have for the American people goes back decades. When the chair of the Communist Party of the United States, Henry Winston, was imprisoned during the McCarthy period and due to mistreatment in prison went blind, Fidel Castro called on JFK to release him. They have shown long support for the working class of the United States of America, and it is important that we live up to their expectations. It is essential that we organize within our communities, within our local and national governments, to call for an end to the blockade on Cuba, to call for the freedom of Cuba from the brutal sanctions and continuous terrorist attacks on Cuban soil and on the representatives of Cuba in the United States government. Could you imagine if the Cuban people had thrown Molotov cocktails at Guantanamo Bay, the naval base which illegally occupies Cuban land to this day? Could you imagine what the US government would have done? And yet here we are with another terrorist attack on the Cuban embassy, and the US government remains silent. They remain apathetic because they have a history of sponsoring this and excusing these kinds of attacks on the Cuban people and on the Cuban Revolution. So it is our job to organize and to finally lift this blockade and pursue a path of peace with the Cuban people. Thank you.
Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live! Let Cuba live! Come on, give a round of applause, round of applause. We are out here today because we don't stand with our terrorist government. We stand with the people of Cuba. We stand with the workers in the Cuban Embassy. This is unacceptable. Viva! Viva! Viva Cuba! Viva Cuba! Cuba sí! Cuba sí! Cuba sí! Cuba sí! Cuba sí! Cuba sí! I know we're out here in the pouring rain, but we got to get a photo to commemorate this struggle, which will not end today. We must get organized. We must visit letcubalive.com. Sign the petition. Get to 1 million signatures. We must